A moment of profound uncertainty unfolded over the gray, choppy waters of the Chesapeake Bay. It was the early autumn of 1942, and the United States Navy was pinning its hopes on a new machine designed to dominate the Pacific skies. At precisely 8:47 on the morning of September 25th, a pilot settled into the cockpit of an F4U Corsair on the deck of the escort carrier USS Sangamon. His task was to determine if this powerful new fighter could perform its most crucial mission, safely landing on a ship at sea. The next half hour would reveal not a triumph, but a frightening instability. This aviator possessed extensive experience, having logged thousands of flight hours across numerous types of naval aircraft. Yet, as he maneuvered his new charge for its first approach toward the pitching deck, an immediate, critical flaw became apparent. The cockpit, situated far behind the engine, offered a severely obstructed view forward. A massive, protruding nose, extending over 14 feet, angled sharply upward during the landing configuration, effectively blinding the pilot to everything directly ahead. He couldn't see the crucial signals from the officer guiding him in, nor the vital arresting wires stretched across the deck. The very platform he was attempting to land on, a steel surface constantly shifting with the ocean swells, was largely invisible. Despite this alarming limitation, the evaluation had to proceed. He committed to the descent, attempting to gauge his position and altitude through fleeting glimpses around the vast engine cowling, relying heavily on peripheral vision. The aircraft slammed onto the wooden planks with a jarring force. But instead of settling, the landing gear's internal shock absorbers, designed to absorb impact, unexpectedly recoiled with immense energy. The Corsair was violently thrown back into the air, as if launched from a spring-loaded platform. It rebounded, briefly airborne again, before crashing back down. Its tailhook skipped uselessly over the arresting wires. The fighter careened precariously across the deck, heading directly for the heavy crash barrier at the far end. Only a desperate surge of power allowed him to climb away, narrowly averting disaster and escaping for a second attempt. The next attempt proved even more perilous, with an uncontrolled bounce sending the aircraft so high it verged on stalling. The third landing brought a new terror, as the hook finally caught a wire, but the fighter slewed dangerously sideways, threatening to tumble violently across the deck. After this fourth harrowing attempt, the pilot brought the aircraft to a halt, powered down the massive engine, and emerged from the cockpit, his hands visibly trembling. Despite the cool bay air, his flight suit was drenched with perspiration. He made his way directly to the waiting assessment officers, delivering a stark, unvarnished truth. This machine was a threat to its own pilots. The F4U Corsair, America's fastest single-engine fighter, specifically designed to counter the formidable Japanese Zero and secure air superiority in the Pacific, was fundamentally unfit for carrier operations. The Navy, after 2 years and millions of dollars of investment, had created what would soon become known as a grim moniker. The individual primarily responsible for this powerful but problematic machine was an engineering marvel himself. Born in 1893 in San Jose, California, he had forged his career from the ground up, beginning as a draftsman and eventually becoming a leading designer of military aircraft. His early life, working in coal mines and surveying, had instilled a pragmatic approach to problem-solving. By the time the Navy issued its ambitious request in February 1938, he had a reputation for tackling engineering challenges others deemed impossible. The Bureau of Aeronautics sought an unprecedented combination: a single-engine, carrier-based fighter that could achieve maximum possible speed while maintaining a remarkably low stalling speed. It needed formidable armament, a 1,000-mile range for the vast distances of the Pacific, and the ability to withstand the tremendous stresses of carrier launches and landings. Every major aircraft manufacturer received the specifications, but this chief engineer made a defining choice for his design. Maximum speed would be paramount. All other considerations, including ease of handling, pilot visibility, and landing characteristics, would be secondary to raw performance. To achieve this, he selected the most potent engine available, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower, double the output of most contemporary fighters. This engine alone weighed nearly a ton and consumed fuel voraciously. It also necessitated a massive propeller, over 13 feet in diameter. This enormous propeller presented an immediate, critical challenge. If mounted on a conventional airframe with standard landing gear, its tips would strike the carrier deck during landing. Extending the landing gear sufficiently would make them too fragile to endure the impacts of carrier operations. This solution was both unconventional and brilliant, an inverted gull wing. This unique design bent sharply downward from the fuselage before sweeping back up, allowing the landing gear to attach at the lowest point of the bend. This kept the struts relatively short and robust while providing ample clearance for the colossal propeller. The bent wing also offered an aerodynamic advantage, reducing drag and contributing to higher speeds. In May 1940, a test pilot took the prototype, the F4U into the air for its inaugural flight. The aircraft proved astonishingly fast, becoming the first American single-engine fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight during trials over Connecticut. The Navy was immensely impressed, and a contract for hundreds of production aircraft was awarded in June 1941, just months before the attack on Pearl Harbor would plunge America into war. However, between the prototype's promising performance and the reality of mass production, the Navy introduced critical modifications that would transform this dream machine into a formidable challenge. Intelligence from the European Air War indicated that the planned armament of 2 nose-mounted and 4 wing-mounted machine guns was inadequate. German aircraft were increasingly armored and equipped with self-sealing fuel tanks, demanding heavier firepower. The Navy insisted on 6.50 caliber machine guns, all mounted in the wings, outside the propeller arc, eliminating the need for synchronization. This change, in turn, required the relocation of the fuel tanks previously situated in the wing leading edges. A new, larger 237-gallon tank had to be installed in the fuselage, directly between the engine and the pilot. To maintain the aircraft's sleek profile, the cockpit itself was moved nearly 3 feet rearward from its original position. This single alteration, made to accommodate increased fuel capacity, inadvertently shifted the Corsair from a promising carrier fighter into a machine infamous for a darker purpose. When the first production F4U took to the skies in June 1942, test pilots immediately began encountering significant difficulties. The rearward placement of the cockpit severely compromised forward visibility, particularly problematic during ground operations where pilots could not see directly ahead for obstacles. During critical landing approaches, the runway or carrier deck remained obscured until the final seconds before touchdown. Further complicating matters, the powerful engine was prone to leaking oil and hydraulic fluid, which often seeped past the cowl flaps and smeared across the windshield. In the humid, salty conditions of the Pacific, this fluid mixed with moisture, creating an opaque film that rendered the windscreen almost useless. Pilots reported feeling as though they were attempting to land through a perpetually dirty window onto a constantly moving platform. The aircraft also exhibited treacherous stall characteristics at low speeds. During the high angle of attack maneuvers essential for carrier landings and intense aerial combat, the left wing would stall asymmetrically before the right, causing a violent, uncommanded snap roll. At low altitudes, this left no time for recovery. Perhaps most terrifying was the engine's immense torque. The sheer rotational force of the engine could overwhelm a pilot's control inputs, particularly if power was applied too rapidly during a missed approach or go-around. This could violently flip the aircraft onto its back. At the low altitudes of carrier landings, often just 200 feet or less, such an event provided no opportunity for correction, inevitably sending the aircraft inverted into the ocean. The initial squadron to receive production Corsairs was designated Fighter Squadron 12, or 5F-12, based at Naval Air Station San Diego in October 1942. The pilots, initially thrilled to be assigned America's fastest fighter, soon found their excitement giving way to grim reality as accidents began to mount. The repositioned cockpit transformed what should have been routine flight phases into perilous gambles. During takeoff, pilots were forced to weave their aircraft down the runway, unable to see directly ahead for obstacles. Crucially, they could not see the landing signal officer on the carrier, nor the arresting wires, the deck edge, or the critical crash barrier. In the most dangerous moments of flight, they were essentially operating blind. Young, inexperienced officers, fresh from training on forgiving aircraft, were suddenly tasked with mastering a machine that offered no quarter. Their previous trainers were designed to be stable and predictable, allowing students ample time to recognize and correct errors. The Corsair, however, offered no such mercy. A momentary lapse of attention, an overly aggressive throttle input, a slight misjudgment during approach, any of these could lead to fatal consequences. The accidents swiftly accumulated. Pilots perished during training flights, stalling at low altitude with insufficient time to recover from the ensuing spin. Others died during landing practice, bouncing over the arresting wires and colliding with the crash barrier. Takeoffs became dangerous endeavors, with the engine's torque rolling aircraft into the ground before adequate altitude could be gained. Even routine formation flying proved hazardous, as poor visibility led to mid-air collisions. A dark humor soon emerged among the surviving pilots of 5F-12. No one could pinpoint the exact origin, but someone began referring to the Corsair as the Ensign Eliminator. Ensigns, the Navy's lowest-ranking commissioned officers, were typically the youngest and least experienced aviators, and thus the most vulnerable to the Corsair's unforgiving nature. The epithet was bitter, yet undeniably accurate. It spread first through the squadron, then to others, eventually permeating the entire naval aviation community. Within months, the nickname was ubiquitous throughout the Pacific Fleet, and within a year, it would be etched into the aircraft's troubled history. Despite the escalating accident rate, the Navy continued its carrier qualification trials. The harrowing tests by the initial pilot on the Sangamon were followed by further evaluations on the training carrier USS Wolverine and the escort carriers USS Core and USS Charger. The results remained consistently alarming. Pilots universally reported the Corsair as nearly impossible to land on a moving deck, describing unpredictable and violent bounces. Visibility remained inadequate, and the stall characteristics deadly. While some evaluators attempted to maintain an optimistic stance, claiming the Corsair was an excellent carrier type and very easy to land aboard, the cold statistics presented a far grimmer picture. Corsairs were crashing at rates significantly higher than other naval aircraft, leading to training fatalities that would have been unacceptable even during active combat. The Navy then assigned a new squadron, 5F-17, to prove the Corsair's viability. Under the leadership of an officer determined to make the aircraft work, this unit was formed in January 1943 at Naval Air Station Norfolk. He aggressively recruited pilots willing to push limits and actively collaborated with engineers to identify and rectify the Corsair's inherent flaws. His pilots embarked on an intensive regimen of carrier landing practice, striving to develop techniques that could compensate for the severe visibility limitations. Despite these concerted efforts, the fundamental problems persisted. During the summer of 1943, 5F-17 conducted carrier qualification trials aboard the USS Bunker Hill during its shakedown cruise off Trinidad. The outcomes were frustratingly consistent. Despite seemingly normal approaches, the Corsairs repeatedly failed to engage the arresting wires, bouncing over the barriers and often colliding with parked aircraft forward on the deck. The squadron's commanding officer, Tom Blackburn, later grimly noted his aircraft were strewing expensive debris in all directions, often breaking in two at the engine mount. The first Marine Corps pilot to die in a Corsair during combat operations was not a victim of the enemy, but of his own aircraft. Marine Fighter Squadron 124, VMF 124, received the initial operational Corsairs in late 1942. The squadron, under the command of Major William Guise, trained intensely at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in California, grappling with the powerful and temperamental fighter. By February 1943, they were deemed combat-ready and deployed to the Pacific. Their destination was Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, then the most fiercely contested patch of land in the Pacific. The Marines had held it since August 1942, defending against relentless Japanese air and ground assaults. The runway itself was scarred by bomb craters and littered with aircraft wreckage, while the surrounding jungle concealed enemy soldiers who periodically infiltrated the perimeter. The Corsairs of VMF 124 were early birdcage models, featuring the visibility-restricting framed canopy and the original landing gear that bounced violently. These were essentially the same aircraft that had nearly ended the career of the initial test pilot on the Sangamon just 4 months earlier. On February 13th, the day after their arrival, the Corsairs flew their inaugural combat mission, escorting B-24 bombers. They returned without incident, pilots noting the aircraft's impressive climb rate and range. But the very next day, Valentine's Day, VMF 124 joined a larger, more complex escort mission to Bougainville. This was the longest escort operation in the Solomon Islands to date, stretching the endurance limits of every fighter involved. Over the target, Japanese fighters intercepted the formation. The engagement quickly devolved into chaos. The Americans lost 2 Corsairs for P-38s and 2 bombers, while the Japanese lost only a single Zero, its pilot colliding with one of the Corsairs. Surviving pilots reported that their F4Us felt sluggish and unresponsive compared to the nimble Zeros. The Japanese fighters could outturn them, get onto their tails, and execute maneuvers the Corsair could not match. This engagement became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 8 American aircraft were lost for 1 Japanese fighter, a bitter and inauspicious combat debut for an aircraft already too dangerous to fly, now appearing too clumsy to fight. More pilots succumbed in the ensuing weeks. Some were shot down by Japanese fighters who quickly learned to exploit the Corsair's limitations in turning combat. Others crashed on takeoff as the engine's torque rolled them into the ground. Still others died on landing, the bouncing gear throwing them off Henderson Field's rough, cratered runway. Ground crews worked ceaselessly, patching bullet holes and replacing damaged components, desperately striving to keep the aircraft operational. Yet, they were battling fundamental design flaws that could not be overcome with mere wrenches and spare parts. One pilot who survived these early, brutal weeks was Kenneth Walsh, a veteran of peacetime naval aviation. He possessed a profound understanding of aircraft performance, recognizing the Corsair's immense potential despite its treacherous handling. He began to experiment with tactics that leveraged the aircraft's strengths while meticulously avoiding its weaknesses. He discovered that while the Corsair could not outturn a Zero, it could outclimb and outdive any Japanese aircraft. The strategy became clear: never engage in a turning fight. Instead, dive on enemy aircraft from above, deliver a single, decisive burst from the 6.50 caliber guns, and then use the Corsair's superior climb rate to regain altitude before the Japanese could react. Hit and run, he instructed. Never turn, never attempt to follow a Zero through a horizontal maneuver. Walsh applied these tactics with devastating effect. In August 1943, he downed 4 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement, followed by 3 more later that month. He became the first Corsair ace, ultimately achieving 21 aerial victories. His success demonstrated that the Corsair, in the hands of a pilot who understood its unique capabilities and limitations, could be a formidable weapon. However, most pilots were not Kenneth Walsh. They were young, relatively unseasoned officers thrown directly into combat, without the luxury of time to develop sophisticated tactics. They made errors, and the unforgiving Corsair punished those errors with death. Official reports consistently attributed accidents to pilot error, and maintenance logs revealed no mechanical deficiencies. Yet every pilot who flew the Corsair understood the grim truth. The aircraft was killing its own at a rate that rivaled actual combat losses. By the spring of 1943, the Navy faced an impossible dilemma. Vast resources had been poured into the Corsair program. Production lines across 3 different manufacturers were churning out hundreds of aircraft monthly. The fleet desperately needed a fighter capable of countering the Zero. Yet the Corsair could not safely operate from aircraft carriers, the very purpose for which it had been conceived. An alternative emerged, the Grumman F6F Hellcat, designed specifically to confront the Zero threat. Incorporating critical lessons from the initial year of Pacific combat, the Hellcat utilized the same powerful engine as the Corsair, but within a more conventional airframe. It lacked the Corsair's raw speed and high-altitude performance, but it was remarkably easy to fly, forgiving of pilot errors, and, crucially, it could land on a carrier without imperiling its pilot. In the spring of 1943, the Navy made a pivotal decision that would define the Pacific Air War. The Corsair would be relegated to the Marine Corps for land-based operations, while the Grumman F6F Hellcat would become the Navy's primary carrier fighter. The Marines, accustomed to utilizing equipment the Navy deemed unsuitable, had previously fought on Guadalcanal with older F4F Wildcats, while the Navy received newer aircraft. Now, they would inherit the Corsair, deemed too hazardous for carrier use. The squadron under Tom Blackburn, the officer who had tirelessly trained his pilots for carrier operations, 5 F-17, received devastating news. Despite months of intensive work developing specialized carrier landing techniques and collaborating on aircraft modifications, they were being removed from the USS Bunker Hill. They would be redeployed to the Solomon Islands as a land-based unit. A Hellcat squadron would take their place on the carrier. Blackburn was furious. His pilots had poured everything into mastering the Corsair for carrier operations, pushing themselves to the brink, practicing countless landings until they could consistently put the fighter on deck. They had collaborated with engineers, proving the aircraft could be made to work with the right techniques and modifications. But the Navy's decision was final. The Corsair was officially unsuitable for carrier duty. Blackburn had meticulously assembled his unit, recruiting aviators he believed possessed the skill and aggression to master the demanding aircraft. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Roger Hedrick, a talented tactician, shared his confidence in the Corsair, eventually becoming one of the Pacific War's leading aces with 12 kills. Together, they cultivated a squadron culture that embraced the inherent challenges of flying such an unforgiving machine. Their distinctive insignia, the Jolly Rogers, emerged directly from the Corsair's name, echoing the swashbuckling heritage of pirates. A squadron pilot, Harry Holmeyer, designed the iconic skull and crossbones that would become one of the most recognized military emblems in history. They painted this symbol on the engine cowlings of their Corsairs, adopting an audacious attitude. From a Navy's perspective, the decision to remove them from carrier duty was not entirely misguided. The Hellcat would indeed prove to be an exceptional carrier fighter, eventually achieving an even higher air-to-air kill ratio than the Corsair. It was simpler to maintain, easier to fly, and resulted in far fewer fatal accidents. However, this reassignment meant that America's fastest and most potent fighter would spend the majority of the war operating from island airstrips, rather than from the carrier decks it was designed to protect. On the evening of November 10th, 1943, in the ready room at Ondango Airfield in the Solomon Islands, a young maintenance officer, Butch Davenport, was sketching modifications on a piece of scrap paper. Ondango, ominously meaning place of death in the local dialect, served as a forward operating base for 5 F-17, the Jolly Rogers squadron, which had been engaged in combat for 2 weeks. Working closely with a field representative from the aircraft's manufacturer, Russ Devila, he had been diligently investigating the alarming rate of pilot fatalities. The Corsair's left-wing stall was not random, nor solely attributable to pilot error or misfortune. It stemmed from a specific aerodynamic characteristic of the wing's design. During high angle of attack maneuvers, airflow over the left wing would separate prematurely compared to the right, causing a sudden loss of lift on one side while the other still generated lift. The inevitable outcome was a violent, uncommanded roll that no pilot could anticipate or counteract. Davenport and Davila believed they had identified a solution. If the right wing could be made to stall concurrently with the left, the aircraft would respond by mushing forward in a controlled manner, rather than snapping into an uncontrollable roll. Their proposed method involved deliberately spoiling the lift on the right wing, slightly reducing its efficiency so it would stall at the same angle of attack as its counterpart. They suggested affixing a small strip of metal to the leading edge of the right wing, just outboard of the gun ports. This strip would disrupt the airflow over the wing's surface at high angles of attack, inducing an earlier separation and reducing lift. It was a crude, field-expedient modification, easily fabricated by any maintenance crew from readily available spare parts. The squadron mechanics initially expressed skepticism. The aircraft's engineers had meticulously designed the wing after thousands of hours of wind tunnel testing, calculating airfoil shapes and dimensions with mathematical precision. Who were they, humble mechanics, to second-guess highly educated aeronautical engineers? But Blackburn, the squadron commander, placed his trust in his pilots and their ground crews. He had built 5 F-17 on the principle that aggressive men who engaged in daily combat often understood their aircraft more intimately than engineers who had never faced an enemy. He authorized the modification on a single aircraft for testing. The results were astonishing. With the stall strip installed, both Corsair wings stalled. Simultaneously, the aircraft remained controllable at low speeds, with pilots perceiving the approaching stall through buffeting in the controls, allowing them to take corrective action before the aircraft became uncontrollable. The violent snap rolls that had claimed so many lives simply ceased. Word spread like wildfire through the squadron. Other pilots immediately demanded the modification for their aircraft. Maintenance crews worked tirelessly through the night, improvising stall strips from whatever materials were at hand: carved wood blocks, bent sheet metal, aluminum strips salvaged from damaged aircraft. Anything that could disrupt airflow in the precise location. Within weeks, every Corsair and 5 F-17 carried this field-improvised modification. The improvement in survival rates was instant and dramatic. Pilots who had previously hesitated to engage at low altitude now flew with increased aggression, pursuing Japanese aircraft through maneuvers that would have been suicidal just weeks prior. The Jolly Rogers subsequently achieved the highest score among Navy Corsair squadrons during the war, downing 154 enemy aircraft in a mere 76 days of combat. 13 of their pilots attained A status. Blackburn credited much of this unprecedented success to the stall strip modification developed by his team at Ondango. Eventually, the aircraft's engineers formally examined the field modification and, through wind tunnel testing, confirmed its efficacy. A standardized metal stall strip became standard equipment on all production Corsairs, beginning with the F4U model. The official documentation, however, credited engineering analysis for the improvement, with the names of Butch Davenport and Russ Davila notably absent from the records. While American pilots grappled with the Corsair's complexities, the British Royal Navy confronted a similar, yet distinct, challenge. They desperately needed capable carrier-based fighters, but their options were severely limited. Indigenous designs, primarily two-seat aircraft optimized for navigation over vast oceans, were too slow and unwieldy to contend with modern single-seat fighters. Even a navalized version of their famed land-based fighter, the Supermarine Sea Fire, while possessing excellent performance, suffered from restricted range and fragile landing gear ill-suited for carrier operations. Through the Lend-Lease program, the Americans offered Corsairs. The British, acutely aware of the aircraft's grim reputation, accepted out of sheer necessity. Any fighter was preferable to none, and the Corsair, at the very least, offered performance that could match the best Japanese aircraft. The initial Corsairs arrived in Britain in late 1943, and British pilots immediately encountered the same issues that had plagued American squadrons: appalling visibility during landing approaches, the long nose obscuring the deck, and the signals from the landing signal officer, whom British pilots referred to as the batsman. The landing gear bounced violently, launching aircraft back into the air and over the arresting wires. The engine's immense torque remained a threat, capable of flipping the aircraft inverted if power was applied too rapidly during a missed approach. Unlike the Americans, however, the British could not simply relegate the Corsair to land-based units. The Royal Navy operated primarily from aircraft carriers as its core method of projecting air power. Their island bases were too far removed from the critical Pacific combat zones. If the Corsair could not function from carriers, it was practically useless to the British. British engineers and pilots approached this problem with the urgency of those facing no alternative. They had to make the Corsair operational on carriers. Failure meant having no effective carrier fighter at all. They began by raising the pilot's seat by 7 inches, an adaptation that significantly improved forward visibility over the nose during approach, as American pilots had sat remarkably low in the cockpit. They further modified the canopy, replacing portions of the framework with clear panels to enhance the field of view. The pervasive oil leak issue was addressed with characteristic British practicality. While American engineers had tried to seal the cowl flaps, British mechanics simply wired the top flaps shut and opened the side flaps. Oil and fluid, previously smearing the windshield, now flowed harmlessly down the sides of the fuselage. They also clipped 8 inches from each wingtip to accommodate the aircraft within their smaller hangar decks, which had lower overhead clearance than American carriers. This modification inadvertently offered another benefit. The reduced wingspan increased wing loading, improving the sink rate during landing approaches and making the Corsair less prone to floating over the deck and missing the arresting wires. Crucially, British pilots adopted a specific landing technique they had already refined for another challenging aircraft. Back in December 1941, during trials aboard HMS Illustrious, Lieutenant Commander H.P. Bramwell had advocated a curving approach for his long-nosed fighter to maintain continuous sight of the batsman. This very technique was now applied to the Corsair. Instead of the traditional straight-in approach used by American pilots, British aviators executed a continuous, gradual left turn from the downwind leg all the way to touchdown. Throughout this entire curved approach, the pilot could look over his left shoulder, keeping the carrier deck in constant view. The long nose, which had previously blocked forward vision, became irrelevant because the pilot was looking sideways, not straight ahead. He could observe the batsman's signals throughout the approach, making necessary corrections. Only in the final seconds before landing would he straighten the aircraft and commit to the deck. This technique demanded intensive practice and precise coordination between pilot and batsman, requiring both to fully understand the other's actions. However, British naval aviators were well-versed in handling difficult landing aircraft, having already developed similar techniques. Applying the curved approach to the Corsair was a natural extension of their existing skills. In June 1943, Number 1830 Naval Air Squadron became the first British unit to operate Corsairs. Their pilots underwent rigorous training in the United States, mastering the curved approach until they could consistently land the aircraft on the Royal Navy's smaller escort carriers. By the close of the year, British Corsairs were successfully operating from their carriers in combat, providing fighter cover for raids against German targets over Norway and participating in operations against Japanese positions in the Pacific. The same aircraft that the American Navy had deemed unsuitable for carrier operations was now flying effectively from British flight decks. American naval authorities took note. If the British could operate Corsairs from their smaller carriers with their potentially less experienced pilots, perhaps the problems were not insurmountable after all. The eventual modifications that made the Corsair truly carrier-capable for American operations did not stem from a single source or a grand design overhaul. Rather, they accumulated over many months of desperate improvisation by pilots, mechanics, engineers, and administrators who simply refused to accept that the aircraft could not be fixed. American maintenance crews adopted a British discovery regarding the landing gear's internal pressure. By increasing the air pressure in the shock absorbers, they could stiffen them effectively eliminating most of the violent bouncing that had caused so many accidents. This modification required no specialized parts or formal engineering approval. Any ground crew could adjust the pressure using standard equipment. The elevated pilot's seat, first implemented by the British, was incorporated into later production models of the F4U. The immediate improvement in visibility was instantly apparent to pilots who had struggled with the lower seating. The manufacturer replaced the restrictive framed canopy with a clear bubble design, providing dramatically improved visibility in all directions. Pilots could now see the deck throughout their landing approach, identify aircraft approaching from behind in combat, and view instruments without craning their necks around structural frames. The crucial stall strip, originally conceived in the Solomon Islands by Butch Davenport, became standard equipment, with assembly lines at all three manufacturers integrating precisely fabricated metal strips onto every new aircraft. The tailwheel strut was lengthened by 6 inches, creating a more level landing attitude. This reduced the nose-up angle during touchdown, further improving visibility during the critical final seconds of approach. Each of these modifications was individually modest. None, on its own, would have resolved the Corsair's fundamental problems. But taken collectively, they transformed the Ensign Eliminator into one of the most capable carrier fighters of the war. On April 22, 1944, following accident-free trials aboard the USS Gambia Bay, the Navy officially accepted the F4U for shipboard operations. The aircraft, formally rejected for carrier duty just 2 years prior, was now cleared to return to the very decks for which it had initially been designed. The first Marine Corsair squadron to successfully operate from an American carrier was VMF 124, the same unit that had endured the St. Valentine's Day massacre more than a year earlier. They joined the USS Essex in December 1944, becoming the first Marine squadron to embark on a fleet carrier. The pilots landing on the Essex's deck were flying an aircraft fundamentally similar to the one that had nearly killed the initial test pilot in Chesapeake Bay. The same engine, the same wing, the same basic airframe. Yet, the accumulated modifications had reshaped a killer into a potent weapon. In August 1943, Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, a battle-hardened aviator, took command of Marine Fighter Squadron 214, the Black Sheep. At 31, he was a decade older than most of his pilots and a veteran of aerial combat in China with the renowned Flying Tigers, having scored victories before many of his new recruits had even learned to fly. He inherited a collection of pilots no other unit wanted, replacements who had missed their original assignments, or men cast off from other units for disciplinary issues. The Marine Corps gave Boyington 4 weeks to forge this disparate group into a combat-ready squadron. He achieved this by pushing the Corsair to its absolute limits, demonstrating its full potential to his pilots. He showed them that despite its terrifying reputation, the Corsair was a magnificent fighting machine when commanded by someone who truly understood its capabilities and limitations. The aircraft was demonstrably faster than any Japanese opponent. It could dive away from a zero at speeds that would tear the Japanese fighter apart. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns could shred an enemy aircraft with a single, accurate burst. Its rugged construction allowed it to absorb incredible battle damage and remain airborne, with pilots often returning from combat with gaping holes in wings, fuselage, and tail that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. The Black Sheep entered combat in September 1943, immediately proving that the Corsair's deadly reputation could be redirected toward the enemy. In their first week of operations, they shot down numerous Japanese aircraft while losing only one of their own. During their initial combat tour, they accounted for 97 Japanese aircraft. A significant percentage of Boyington's pilots became aces, achieving 5 or more aerial victories. Boyington himself claimed 22 kills with the Black Sheep, bringing his total to 28, counting his earlier victories. He became the highest-scoring Marine ace of the war and one of the most celebrated pilots in the Pacific. In January 1944, Boyington led a fighter sweep over Rabaul, a critical Japanese base. He was attempting to surpass the American record for aerial victories. During the ensuing engagement, he shot down one Japanese aircraft, his 28th kill, before being brought down himself by enemy fighters. He parachuted into the water, where he was captured by a Japanese submarine crew, enduring brutal imprisonment for the remainder of the war. The Japanese never reported his capture, and for 18 months, the Marine Corps listed him as missing in action, presumed dead. When liberated in August 1945, he returned to a hero's welcome. President Harry Truman presented him with the Medal of Honor, which had been posthumously awarded when his fate was unknown. The record of the Black Sheep Squadron stood as definitive proof. The aircraft itself was never truly the problem. The challenge had always been asking young pilots to fly an unforgiving machine before anyone understood how to make it forgiving. The Japanese quickly observed the shift in American Corsair tactics. Pilots who had learned to exploit the F4U's earlier weaknesses now found those vulnerabilities largely absent. The American fighter, once prone to stalling and spinning at low altitude, now maintained control through maneuvers that would have been suicidal in earlier versions. The aircraft that had been relatively easy prey in a turning fight now rolled with unexpected authority, a direct result of the stall strips and other accumulated modifications. Japanese combat reports from late 1944 and early 1945 noted the increased aggression and improved results of American Corsair pilots. Initially, some Japanese aviators attributed these changes to enhanced American training or tactics. Only gradually did they grasp that the aircraft itself had fundamentally evolved. This shift profoundly impacted the psychological state of Japanese pilots. For 2 years, they had absolute dominance in turning combat. Their A6M0 fighters could outmaneuver anything the Americans fielded, a fact they knew with absolute certainty. This confidence had allowed them to engage aggressively, pressing attacks that more cautious tactics might have avoided, secure in their ability to get behind an American fighter and stay there. When the Corsair unexpectedly became competitive in maneuvering combat, Japanese pilots lost this psychological edge. Some became hesitant, breaking off attacks they would have pressed eagerly in previous months. Others compensated by taking even greater risks, closing to shorter ranges before firing, or pursuing Americans into situations from which they could not escape. Aggression, without the underpinning of superior capability, often led to fatal consequences. By early 1945, the kill ratio had dramatically shifted. Corsairs were destroying Japanese aircraft at an astounding rate of 11:1. For every Corsair lost to enemy action, 11 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky. American pilots completed over 64,000 combat missions in Corsairs during the war, claiming 2,140 air-to-air victories against a mere 189 Corsairs lost to enemy aircraft. No other American fighter achieved a better combat record in the Pacific theater. The F4U continued its service long after the Pacific War concluded. When conflict erupted in Korea in June 1950, Marine and Navy Corsairs remained operational, having served for nearly a decade. Yet, they were still among the most capable ground attack platforms available. Corsairs launched from offshore carriers and land bases in South Korea, providing crucial support to American and South Korean troops with bombs, napalm rockets, and strafing runs. In August 1950, VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron made famous by Pappy Boyington, flew its first combat mission of the Korean War, launching from the escort carrier USS Sicily to attack enemy installations near Incheon. The same squadron that had terrorized Japanese pilots over the Solomon Islands now confronted a new enemy, utilizing the very aircraft that had served them so effectively in the preceding conflict. The Corsair truly excelled in the close air support role. Jet fighters of the era, while faster, consumed fuel at prodigious rates and could only loiter over the battlefield for mere minutes. The Corsair, however, could circle above friendly troops for extended periods, awaiting calls for support before diving in with devastating accuracy. Ground crews appreciated the Corsair for its straightforward maintenance and its remarkable ability to absorb tremendous battle damage, with pilots frequently returning aircraft bearing holes in wings, fuselage, and tail that would have crippled more fragile jet aircraft. Lieutenant Guy Bordelin became the Navy's sole ace of the Korean War, flying a Corsair night fighter. Between late June and mid-July 1953, he shot down 5 enemy aircraft, including Soviet-built Lavokin fighters and Yakovlev trainers used for night harassment raids. He was also the only American ace in Korea to achieve all his victories in a propeller-driven aircraft, a testament to the Corsair's enduring combat effectiveness. In September 1952, Marine Captain Jesse Fulmer, flying an F4U-4B on a ground attack mission over North Korea, unexpectedly encountered a Soviet-built MiG-15 jet fighter. The MiG, one of the world's most advanced combat aircraft at the time, was capable of speeds approaching 650 miles per hour and could climb to altitudes the Corsair could never reach. Most pilots in such a situation would have attempted to escape, diving low and fleeing to friendly territory. Fulmer, however, attacked. He skillfully maneuvered his vintage Corsair into a firing position, unleashing a burst of 20mm cannon fire into the jet fighter. The MiG plummeted, its pilot reportedly stunned that a propeller-driven antique had achieved guns on him. A fighter designed in 1938 had successfully engaged and downed one of the most advanced jet fighters on the planet. Other MiGs soon arrived and shot down Fulmer's Corsair in turn, but he parachuted safely into the Yellow Sea and was subsequently rescued by a Navy helicopter. The Corsair had demonstrated that even in the dawning age of jets, it remained a formidable weapon in the hands of a truly skilled pilot. The French Navy employed Corsairs during the First Indochina War, from 1952 to 1954, against Viet Minh forces. French pilots conducted ground attack missions from aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin, supporting troops fighting in the dense jungles of Vietnam years before significant American involvement. The Corsair saw combat again during the Suez Crisis in 1956 and the Algerian War. Some Corsairs continued flying combat missions nearly 2 decades after the initial terrifying test flight on the Sangaman. The final Corsair rolled off the production line in January 1953. Vought, Goodyear, and Brewster had collectively built 12,571 aircraft over 11 years of continuous production. It stood as the longest production run of any piston engine fighter in American history, a truly remarkable achievement for an aircraft once considered too dangerous for carrier operations. Rex Bissell, the engineer who had designed the Corsair, prioritizing maximum speed above all else, lived to witness the ultimate vindication of his creation. He remained with the aircraft manufacturer until the early 1950s, eventually becoming a vice president, before retiring to Sarasota, Florida. He had been correct about the aircraft's inherent capabilities. He had simply underestimated the sheer difficulty of safely unlocking that potential. The modifications that eventually made the Corsair great were not failures of his initial design. Rather, they represented the natural evolution of any complex machine, as both engineers and operators gradually comprehend its true capabilities. This is often how genuine innovation occurs in warfare. Not through flawlessly designed systems that perform perfectly from the outset, but through the desperate improvisation of dedicated individuals who refuse to accept failure. The Corsair earned its initial grim moniker honestly. It was, indeed, an Ensign Eliminator, claiming the lives of young pilots whose training had not adequately prepared them for its unforgiving demands. Yet, it ultimately became something far greater. This transformation occurred because men like Butch Davenport and Russ Devila, along with Tom Blackburn and the British pilots who pioneered the curved approach, collectively refused to allow the killing to continue. Every modification was a deliberate choice, every improvement a testament to someone deciding that the next pilot did not have to die. The raised seat, the stall strip, the bubble canopy, the curved approach, the increased landing gear pressure. These were individually minor changes, seemingly insignificant on their own. Yet, together, they saved hundreds of lives and contributed to winning a war. The final tally tells a powerful story. 2,140 victories against 189 losses, an 11-to-1 kill ratio unmatched by any other American fighter in the Pacific. Over 64,000 missions flown. These numbers seemed utterly impossible when that initial test pilot stepped out of his cockpit on the Sangamon, declaring to the Navy that their supposed wonder weapon was actively trying to kill him. The Corsair did not achieve legendary status because it was flawlessly designed from the start. It became a legend because imperfect people steadfastly refused to give up on an imperfect machine, discovering solutions that the original designers had overlooked and inventing techniques no one had initially taught. It took a village of dedicated individuals across nations to bend a formidable, flawed machine to the will of its pilots and, in doing so, etch its name into history.